Hello and welcome back to this course of videos on Node.js and Express. Now in this video we'll be looking at generating post requests using AJAX and also introducing the concept of SPAs, which stands for Single Page Application. So this diagram here is something that you may remember from previous videos. It's the HTTP request response cycle. The client sends a request object to the server, and the server responds with a response object. Both the request and the response objects have a header and a body section. Now, I'm going to walk through the previous video where we submitted a GET request and used AJAX, the render method, to send back a page to our client. I'm going to walk through how that worked with this diagram. So really the event on the client side, we simply just entered a particular URL and hit return. But really it would be the same as if you had an anchor tag, and you click to hyperlink. That's really the event that's being mimicked here. Now, it was a GET request, so the request object, within a header, the three most common header fields within an HTTP header are really URL, method, and content type. So the URL was a mixture of things. It was the URL of our node server, which was localhost, but also within the URL, if you remember, we used root parameters and query string to pass data from the client to the server. We used this URL header field in the request object's header. So the method was get, and the content type was actually nothing because there's no body to get requests. That's the difference between get and post. Post requests actually have some content in the body. Get requests do not. So our node server received this get request with some data that were worked into the URL via those parameters. Now, our server then used EJS, which we downloaded from npm, and EJS basically used the index.ejs HTML file and then merged in the data that was passed on the URL through the route parameter and the query string, and then on the server, it dynamically created our page to serve back. So then it served the response back. Now the content type would have been text /HTML, because the response obviously does have a body. So we would be telling the browser that an HTML file is on the way back. Then the client would receive that and showed that page to us. If you remember, we had the name of the user was displayed and the username was displayed, and all this was created dynamically on the server side. Now, before we move on to what we'll be doing in the next video, we'll just note that when you submit requests in this manner, it does what's called a full page refresh. So the client, when it sends a request in this manner, it will refresh completely. So download a completely brand new page from the server. Now, what we'll be doing in the next video is actually we're going to be changing this request in really three different ways. Now, the first way is instead of submitting the data via the URL, we showed two ways that you can submit data using a GET request. Use it via the URL, which we just spoke about. Now, a third way to submit data from a client to a server is via the body, but in order to do that, you have to use a post request. So we're actually going to use a post request. Instead of submitting our data via the URL, we're using a post request and submitting our data in the body. So that's the first key difference. Now, given that it's actually username that we're submitting, there is a benefit to using post requests in that they're slightly more secure, because submitting data via URL can be seen by anyone. I mean, you still need to encrypt when you're sending stuff through in a body, but it's slightly more secure than sending sending data through on the URL. So that's a benefit of post requests. Another benefit is you can basically send a lot more data. You're quite limited if you're just using your URL to send data, but sending a post request, now you have access to fill up this body. We can submit a lot more data. So that's the first big change. The second big change is the event that's triggering the request to the server. We're going to be using AJAX here. Now, I mentioned previously about a full page refresh. Now, we don't want to generate a full page refresh. We want to mimic something that's called a single page application. Now, a single page application basically means you download everything that your client needs on the first download, right? That's not strictly true, because you can do AJAX requests to pull back small pieces of data, but you're not fully refreshing the page. You're basically downloading the foundation of your page on the first request, and then you're never doing a full page refresh again. You are just pinging the server for small bits of data and then working it into here. So this is why we want to use AJAX, because it stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Now, it's the asynchronous part we're interested in. We don't want to be sending the request and then waiting for the response to come back for a full page refresh. We want to send the event, provide a callback function, and then when that callback function, when the response is received, we fire the callback function and then update the page, but not full page refresh. So that's the second big piece, is that we're using AJAX rather than traditional method of triggering this request. Now the third big difference is that the logic to create our page is not going to be done on the server, it's going to be done on the client side. So again, previously using EJS, EJS dynamically created our page on the server and then sent the whole thing back to the client. As I mentioned in relation to the SPA, single page application earlier, this time our server is just going to send back a small piece of JSON data to the client. And then the client is where the logic resides, the JavaScript logic resides, to update the page. So we're moving some work from the server, the work of dynamically curating the page, from the server to the client. So to recap exactly how it's going to work, the request is going to be made using AJAX. The URL is just going to be the URL of our server. We're using localhost at the moment, but we will upload to a server later. But there'll be no query strings or root parameters on this URL. The method will be post rather than get. Now the content type will actually be populated here. Our content type, because we're going to have something in our body and we're going to use JSON. You can use another method called URL encoded. There's two main ways that you would transmit data on a post request. We're going to use JSON, so we're going to set our content type header field to JSON. Then when the server gets to it, the server, we're going to create a separate route because we have to route for a post request rather than a get request. Now our server, instead of sending back as it did with EJS, sending back the full page back to the client, it's going to respond with just the username and the username of the user and the name of the user with JSON. So again, the header here, the content type, not going to be HTML, it's going to be JSON because we're transmitting back JSON to the client. The JSON is going to get back to our client. Then our callback function will run. It will use this JSON that's been transmitted back to then update our page without a full page refresh, thus following the concept of the single page application. So I hope that explains to you, gives you a good foundation understanding of how the difference between the GET request we did in the previous video and the POST request we're about to do in the next video. So I'll see you in the next video, and we will demonstrate this request response POST with code. I look forward to seeing you then.